Welcome to an incredible and teachable story, the channel where each narrative we share illuminates life's most profound lessons. Today, we invite you to step into the quiet streets of Elmwood, where one woman's act of courage and compassion sparks a journey of healing and redemption. Meet Catherine Moore, a retired nurse whose life changes the day she decides to look beyond the shadows and reach out. In her story, you'll discover that the smallest gestures can mend the deepest wounds, and that true strength lies in our ability to forgive and connect with others. Join us as we explore a tale of second chances, empathy, and the powerful ripple effect of kindness. If you enjoy stories that uplift and teach, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to An Incredible and Teachable Story for more inspiring journeys that remind us of the beauty in being human.
Elmwood Village was a place where secrets lived quietly, tucked between the creaking floorboards of forgotten houses, whispered under the breath of autumn winds. The town had once thrived, its streets full of life, laughter, and light. But now it sat shrouded in a gentle melancholy, fading slowly like the autumn leaves that lined its cracked sidewalks. It was a town where the days stretched long and the nights felt endless, where people kept their curtains drawn and their conversations short. And perhaps no one understood this slow, quiet erosion better than Catherine Moore. Catherine Moore's house stood as a small beacon of care amidst Elmwood's tired streets, like a carefully tended corner of an abandoned garden. At 68, Catherine's life was simple, filled with routines and rituals. She'd lived here long enough to see Elmwood's golden years come and go. Now, in her widowhood, she watched over the neighborhood from her small window, a quiet observer with a keen eye. Once, she had been a nurse, used to working under the harsh lights of the ER, where life and death were separated by mere moments. But that was another life, a life before the silence of her home became her companion. Since her husband's passing, Catherine had settled into solitude, finding comfort in the predictability of her days. Inside, Catherine sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea as she stared out the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. Her small home was filled with mementos, a photograph of her late husband, worn medical books stacked neatly in the corner, and a well-used pair of gardening gloves by the door. Every morning, Catherine woke early, brewed herself a cup of tea, and tended to her garden. She knew the names of every flower she planted, just as she once knew the names of every patient she treated. The garden had become her solace, a way to stay busy, a way to keep her hands occupied in the stillness of her days. After her husband passed, Catherine found herself drifting, her days long and shapeless. She joined the community center to fill the hours, volunteering wherever she could, becoming a friendly face in a place she used to know well. The neighbors knew her as a kind woman with a gentle smile and a knack for listening, and while they didn't know her well, they trusted her to look after things in Elmwood. But today, Catherine's routine was disrupted by a letter. It had arrived without fanfare, a plain white envelope in the sea of bills and advertisements, but the handwriting struck her immediately. Margaret, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, a sister she hadn't seen in even longer. Catherine's heart tightened as she stared at the letter, memories rising unbidden. There had been a rift, one too painful to mend, or so she'd thought. But now, holding this letter, Catherine felt that old wound open just slightly, stirring a quiet ache she thought she had buried long ago. Catherine placed the letter on the table, unopened, unsure if she was ready to revisit a past she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The next day, Catherine was in her front yard, trimming her chrysanthemums when Alice, her neighbor and friend, approached. Alice, a cheerful woman in her 70s, often stopped by to chat, her bright scarf and lively voice a welcome contrast to Elmwood's muted streets. Alice was one of Catherine's few friends in Elmwood, a woman as vibrant as the scarf she wore and just as prone to gossip. The two had become close in recent years, sharing cups of tea and stories from their pasts. Alice, ever curious, had a knack for noticing the smallest changes, and today her sharp eyes caught Catherine's silence. "You're a bit quieter than usual, aren't you, Catherine?" Alice said, tilting her head with a knowing look. Catherine hesitated, feeling the weight of her own reluctance, then finally nodded, and admitted, "It's my sister, Margaret. She wrote to me, after all this time." Alice's gaze softened. Margaret, yes, the one Catherine hadn't seen or spoken to in decades. It's been years, hasn't it? Alice observed gently. Catherine could only nod again, unsure of what to make of it. But then, as her attention drifted, Alice noticed something down the street. She lowered her voice, eyes narrowing as she looked toward an old, decrepit house at the end of the block. Have you noticed that new man at the end of the street? Quiet fellow, keeps odd hours, she said, her voice tinged with intrigue. Elmwood's close-knit community had always been wary of strangers, and now, with new faces and old secrets reappearing, the town's collective curiosity was piqued. Catherine listened, her gaze drifting down the street, where the shadows seemed just a bit darker around the old house. Catherine was no stranger to curiosity. She knew the allure of a good mystery, the thrill of uncovering a story piece by piece. In the ER, it had been part of her job, the challenge of reading between the lines. But here in Elmwood, she told herself she wanted peace. She told herself not to pry, not to let herself get drawn in. Yet, something in her resisted. This stranger was alone, much like she was, and something about that called to her, despite her better judgment. Catherine is in her living room, staring at the unopened letter on her coffee table, her mind distant. She glances back outside, catching a glimpse of the shadowy house at the end of the street. She thought of the years she spent trying to keep herself closed off from the world, from memories too painful to confront. She wondered if, perhaps, she wasn't as alone as she'd believed. But this wasn't her place. She'd left the probing questions and the instinct to dig deeper in the ER. And yet, a small voice whispered, telling her that sometimes people watched from the sidelines because they didn't know how to reach out, just as she once had. Maybe it was time she did something different. Catherine turns from the window, her fingers brushing the edge of the letter, hesitating, her mind pulled between the desire to stay in the safety of her solitude and the pull to understand the lives of those around her. Elmwood had always been a place where people came and went quietly, slipping into the routines of the town as effortlessly as an autumn leaf falls to the ground. But every so often, someone new would arrive, someone who didn't quite blend into the muted patterns of daily life here. And one evening, Catherine Moore found herself watching one of these newcomers. Liam Wilder had arrived in Elmwood, though not with the warmth or the friendliness of other newcomers. He was quiet, reserved, and seemed to be more shadow than man, slipping in and out of the house like he was trying not to be seen. In the following days, Catherine noticed that he kept to himself, rarely exchanging more than a nod or a brief wave with the neighbors. He would appear briefly in the morning, only to disappear again until late evening, his arrival marked only by the soft creak of his front door. Days passed, and he remained a mystery, a stranger who seemed content to keep his distance, as though he carried a secret too heavy for the light of day. One evening, Catherine's attention is drawn to the sound of voices drifting from Liam's yard. Squinting through the dusk, she notices a woman with dark hair standing across from Liam, her arms crossed tightly as if to keep herself contained. Her posture is defensive, her words sharp but barely audible from a distance. Catherine can only catch a few muffled phrases, each one layered with tension. The woman's name, Catherine would later learn, was Sofia Alvarez. Her presence seemed both expected and unsettling, as though the ground between them was familiar but fractured. Catherine could only guess at their history. From her vantage point, she noticed the way Sofia's shoulders tensed, the way Liam's hands stayed at his sides, clenched and unmoving. Whatever bound them together was strained and uncomfortable, a connection that seemed as fragile as it was tense. As the days wore on, Sofia's visits became routine. Sometimes she would arrive in the early morning, leaving before anyone else in the neighborhood stirred. Other times she would stand with him in the yard, the two of them exchanging low, hurried words as if afraid to let their voices carry too far. Elmwood was a town that ran on routines and predictability. But this was something different. On a breezy autumn afternoon, Catherine meets Alice again outside her house, both women pausing to catch up on the neighborhood happenings. As always, Alice's curiosity gets the better of her, her eyes darting toward Liam's house as she mentions the newcomer. Alice, ever curious and prone to gossip, had already taken note of Liam's peculiar habits. "Did you know," she murmured to Catherine with a hint of mischief, "he's not the first stranger to pass through Elmwood recently. A few months back, there was that woman renting a place on Oak Street, a quiet one. She barely lasted a week, and now, here he is." Alice's words lingered, a small ember of suspicion that caught Catherine's interest, despite herself. Alice speculated freely, her imagination filling in the blanks with dark possibilities, suggesting that Liam might be hiding something from his past, something that wouldn't sit well with the town's cautious residents. Catherine listened, her mind churning with thoughts of her own. She reminded herself of her years in the ER, of the many faces she had seen and the stories that hid behind them. People were rarely what they seemed at first glance, and yet she couldn't help but wonder, could Alice be right? Could there be a shadow following Liam, a reason he stayed hidden in the edges of Elmwood's routines? Catherine's instincts had once been her greatest tool, a way to see beyond appearances and into the hidden recesses of people's hearts. As a nurse, it was her gift, her quiet intuition. But here, in Elmwood, it was different. Here she wanted peace, a life free from the shadows and secrets she had encountered daily in her career. Still, something in her stirred as she watched Liam's house, the light in his window flickering like a signal just out of reach. Her hands rested on the edge of the windowsill, the faint pressure grounding her, holding her back from crossing a line she had drawn for herself long ago. But it was the mystery of him, the way he seemed to carry the weight of something unseen, that kept her coming back to the window. And as much as she reminded herself to look away, to return to her garden and her letters, the pull of curiosity was too strong. She felt it rising in her, a small, persistent urge that whispered to her in the quiet of the night. Catherine retreats from the window, her gaze lingering just a moment longer on Liam's house before she turns away. As days turned into weeks, Catherine's curiosity grew, slipping quietly into her thoughts, her routines, and eventually, her evenings spent at the window. She began keeping a journal, a small leather-bound notebook where she jotted down observations, seemingly innocent at first. The hour Liam left, the time he returned, the frequency of Sophia's visits. But soon the journal became something more. It captured her thoughts, her questions, and, most unexpectedly, her doubts. Catherine is seated at her kitchen table, the journal opened in front of her. A soft light casts shadows across the page as she writes. Each entry was a window into Catherine's evolving suspicions. She wrote in careful, quiet sentences, recording details she thought might matter, moments that felt strange. At first, it was just times and dates. 9:30 p.m., Liam returns, carrying groceries. Sophia arrives. They argue quietly in the yard. But over time, the entries changed. Liam looks tired tonight, burdened. Sophia left in tears. Why? Through her journal, Catherine began to see Liam not just as a mystery, but as a person, a man with a past, perhaps one he couldn't outrun. And in the quiet of her evenings as she wrote, her empathy began to grow, catching her off guard with its strength. And for you watching, tell us, have you ever been drawn into a mystery like this? Have you ever found yourself watching someone, wondering who they really are beneath the surface? If you're as intrigued as Catherine is, then like this video. Alice has noticed the change in her friend's mood, her distracted glances toward the end of the street, her frequent pauses as though her mind is elsewhere. Alice, ever the observant friend, had begun to worry about Catherine's new obsession. She had known Catherine long enough to see when something was stirring beneath her friend's calm exterior. "You're spending an awful lot of time thinking about that man, aren't you?" she remarked one afternoon, her tone half joking but tinged with genuine concern. Alice's words were light, but Catherine could feel the weight behind them. A silent warning, a reminder to tread carefully. But for Catherine, that caution felt almost irrelevant. She was a woman of habit, of routine, and yet something about Liam Wilder had unsettled her, drawing her in like a moth to a dim, wavering flame. As the days wore on, Alice grew bolder, voicing her concerns more directly. She would watch Catherine as she glanced toward Liam's house, eyebrows raised, a faint smile playing on her lips. She wanted to remind her friend of life beyond the mysteries of the neighborhood, of the real friendships they shared, and the laughter that brightened Elmwood on good days. Later, Catherine finds herself staring at an old photograph, one taken in the hospital where she worked. The image brings memories rushing back. Long before she was simply Catherine Moore, the quiet widow of Elmwood, she had been Nurse Catherine, sharp-eyed, calm, unflinching in the face of emergencies. The ER had been her world, a place where instincts and observation could mean the difference between life and death. But there had been one patient in particular, a man who had come to her broken and terrified, trusting her with a terrible secret, a secret she could not keep, a truth she was forced to share despite his desperate pleas. That moment, that betrayal, haunted her still, lingered like a shadow on her heart. She had often wondered if she could have done things differently, if she could have found a way to help him without breaking his trust. Now, watching Liam from her window, Catherine felt that same pull, the urge to protect, to make things right, to uncover the truth before something tragic could unfold. But was it her instinct as a nurse, or the lingering guilt from a past she couldn't forget? One afternoon, Alice and Catherine sit on Catherine's porch, surrounded by the soft hum of Elmwood. Alice senses the tension in her friend's gaze as she stares toward Liam's house once again. Alice could see the tension building in Catherine, the way her gaze seemed to drift away, caught on some invisible thread. "You know, Catherine," Alice began slowly, choosing her words with care, "sometimes loneliness makes us look for things that might not be there." Catherine turned, the faintest hint of surprise in her eyes, but Alice pressed on. She had seen it before in others. People who reached for mysteries when life felt too quiet, too empty. "You've spent so much time alone since your husband passed. You're just projecting, don't you think?" But Catherine's face hardened. A flicker of frustration flashed across her features. How could Alice understand the depth of her instincts, the feeling that something was truly wrong? She thought back to the lives she had touched, the countless hours she'd spent deciphering the silent cries of her patients. Her gaze turned back toward the street, toward the house where Liam's light flickered uncertainly in the gathering dusk. Alice saw the resolve in her friend's expression and sighed, feeling the distance grow between them as Catherine's obsession deepened. In her heart, Catherine knew Alice was trying to protect her, to pull her back from a path that could lead to disappointment, even danger. But the pull of the mystery was too strong. Catherine could only nod absently, her mind already wandering back to Liam, to Sophia, and to the story she was sure lay hidden within the walls of that quiet, shadowed house. Catherine remains on her porch long after Alice leaves, her mind turning over the quiet accusations, the warnings she tried to brush aside. Her hands absently trace the edges of her journal, her fingers lingering on the cover as though seeking reassurance. Catherine could hear Alice's words echoing in her mind, that gentle reminder not to lose herself in a mystery that might not even be real. But something within her, something deep and unrelenting, urged her on. Perhaps, she thought, it was better to risk misunderstanding than to ignore what might truly be a cry for help. And so, with each passing day, Catherine found herself edging closer to the secrets that lay hidden in Elmwood. Hey there, don't forget to like this video if you too feel the pull of the unknown. Stay with us, and together we'll follow Catherine as she navigates the fine line between curiosity and obsession, empathy, and the weight of the past. The story is just beginning. Curiosity has a way of growing, of taking root in the quiet corners of the mind. For Catherine Moore, what had started as idle observation had bloomed into something far stronger, something she could no longer ignore. She found herself watching Liam's house more often, noticing the faint glow in his window late at night, the way he seemed to move in shadows, and in those quiet hours a strange determination settled over her. She began rising earlier than usual, timing her morning walks to catch glimpses of Liam's routine. She watched him leave the house in the early hours, always just before dawn, his car winding down Elmwood's empty streets. Some mornings, she would even follow him at a distance, watching as he drove off, disappearing down roads she herself rarely traveled. And then, one cold morning, her efforts finally yielded something unexpected. As she passed his front gate, she heard his voice, soft, tense, the faintest hint of desperation lacing his words. Through the open window, fragments of his conversation reached her, words that seemed heavy with urgency and regret. "Starting over, no choice, I just need more time." Each phrase was weighted, unfinished. yet filled with a longing she couldn't quite understand. And so, as his words lingered in the morning air, Catherine's suspicion deepened, taking hold in the quiet spaces of her mind. What could make a man so desperate to start over, to leave everything behind? It was a question that would not let her rest. Yet, with every step she took further into the mystery, a sense of guilt began to creep in, wrapping itself around her curiosity like vines on an old wall. She could almost hear her husband's voice, a memory brought back by the quiet of her empty house. He had always told her to let things be, to avoid meddling in the lives of others. He had been the calm one, the grounding force in her life, reminding her to find peace and simplicity, to seek comfort in the known. Sometimes it's best not to ask questions you don't want answers to, he had once said, with a gentle smile she remembered so clearly. But something about this situation felt different. The thought that someone in her town, someone who passed her on these quiet streets, might be carrying a weight too heavy to bear alone, it pulled at her, stirred a resolve she thought she'd left behind. And though her husband's words lingered, their warmth unable to shield her from her growing sense of duty, she felt compelled to press forward, to see this through, even if it meant crossing lines she had carefully drawn for herself. As if in answer to her unease, the past had found its way back to her. Another letter had arrived, bearing the same handwriting as before, the same name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, Margaret, her sister, a person tied to memories both tender and painful, a relationship fractured beyond repair. The first letter had gone unread, left in a drawer, as though hiding it might bury the hurt it brought with it. But this second letter, now resting in her hands, felt heavier, its unspoken words filling her with a familiar ache. It was a reminder of things left unresolved, of wounds that time had not quite healed, and so the letter sat unopened on her kitchen table. It became a silent fixture, a symbol of the betrayal she could not forgive, the broken bond she could not forget. In a way, it was easier to focus on Liam and his troubles, to direct her care outward, than to turn inward and face the pain that had lingered in her own life for so long. Later that day, Catherine finds herself walking toward the Elmwood Community Center, her footsteps slow but purposeful. Inside, she spots Ruth, a volunteer known for her work with troubled teens, a woman with a quiet strength and a gentle wisdom that many sought for comfort. Catherine had always kept her worries close, sharing only small fragments with Alice, but today the weight of her suspicions had grown too heavy, and she knew she needed another perspective, someone who might understand her concern without dismissing it. Ruth had once worked with troubled teens and seemed to have a way of seeing through people, understanding what others missed. As they sat in the quiet of the community center, Catherine shared her observations, the early morning walks, the overheard words, the tension she had seen between Liam and Sophia. And when she was done, Ruth listened, her expression thoughtful, her eyes filled with understanding. "Maybe he needs help, Catherine," Ruth said gently, her words laced with empathy. "And maybe there's a story behind this that you haven't yet seen. But if you feel something isn't right, sometimes it's worth listening to that feeling." Together, they began to consider how they might reach out, how they could approach this mystery without intrusion, without judgment. For Ruth, it was a familiar challenge, the task of helping without prying, of offering support to those too proud or too fearful to ask for it outright. She suggested they start small, find ways to learn more, to be there if Liam needed them, if Sophia needed someone they could trust. With Ruth's support, Catherine felt a flicker of hope. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of something larger, a quiet network of care that might in time draw Liam out from the shadows. And though doubt still lingered, though the unopened letter from her sister reminded her of the pain and betrayal she had yet to confront, she knew she could not stop now. Sometimes, people came into our lives for reasons we could not yet understand, and maybe, just maybe, her own journey was tied to Liam's in ways she hadn't yet uncovered. Her resolve deepened, her heart caught between the urge to help and the scars of her own past as she pressed on, drawn ever deeper into the mystery unfolding on Elmwood's quiet streets. Some mysteries unravel in silence, like threads pulling apart in the quiet of the night, but others burst open, revealing secrets that were too heavy to stay hidden. For Catherine, the answers she had been seeking came not through whispers or faint suspicions, but through an encounter so raw and unguarded, it left her shaken to the core. It was on one of these quiet walks that they first saw her. Sophia, hurrying out of Liam's house, her face streaked with tears, her expression marked by something between despair and frustration. Her steps were quick, almost frantic, as though she were desperate to escape something she could no longer bear. Catherine and Ruth exchanged a look, both feeling the gravity of the moment, the silent urgency. And without speaking, they followed her, their concern stronger than the uncertainty of where this would lead. Sophia made her way to a small cafe on the edge of town, a quiet place where few people would think to go. She slipped into a booth by the window, and Catherine and Ruth hesitated only a moment before stepping inside and taking the seat across from her. Sophia looks up, startled, her eyes red, a slight tremor in her hands as she tries to compose herself. As she listened, Catherine felt an old wound stir within her, a wound she had carefully avoided wrapped in the quiet of her own heart. Her sister, Margaret, the letters, the memories, the years of silence that stretched between them. How long had it been since she had even spoken her sister's name aloud? It was easier to hold on to the pain, to let the wound fester in the comfort of solitude than to confront the ache of forgiveness. But as she watched Sophia, a young woman struggling to bridge the gap between herself and her father, Catherine felt the weight of her own past pressing against her heart. What would it mean to reach out? To let go of the pride, the anger, the resentment that had kept them apart? What would it mean to face the possibility that even now, after so much time had passed, healing might still be possible? For the first time in years, Catherine found herself wondering if she could, in fact, forgive. In that quiet moment, Catherine's life began to shift, the pieces of her own story refracting through Sophia's. Her heart, once guarded, began to soften, to open to the possibility that perhaps not all wounds were meant to remain closed. Perhaps some, like Sophia's, like Liam's, even like her own, were simply waiting for the right moment to heal. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over Elmwood, casting a warm glow across the quiet streets, Catherine walked purposefully to Liam's house. She had spent hours rehearsing what she wanted to say, her heart heavy with the decision to cross the boundaries she'd drawn between them. But now, standing at his door, she felt a quiet resolve take hold. The door opened and Liam stood before her, his expression guarded but curious, as though he hadn't expected anyone to reach out in such a direct way. In her gentle way, Catherine extended an invitation, telling him about the upcoming volunteer event at the community center. She suggested he come, told him it would be good for him to meet people, to remind the town that he was, after all, one of them. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with care, as if coaxing a wild animal from its shelter. Liam looked uncertain, a flicker of discomfort passing over his face. But Catherine's words were steady, softened by her own vulnerability as she confessed her regrets, the distance that had grown between her and her own sister, a chasm that now seemed impossible to cross. "I've learned the hard way," she told him, her voice barely above a whisper, "that isolation has a way of consuming you, of becoming a prison." Her eyes met his, and in that moment, she knew he understood. For a long while, Liam said nothing, his gaze shifting toward the ground as if he were weighing the possibilities, the risks of accepting her offer. But finally, with a hesitant nod, he agreed. Catherine left his doorstep with a sense of quiet accomplishment, her heart lifting with the hope that maybe, just maybe, her small gesture could bring him one step closer to healing. Over the following weeks, Catherine's bond with Sophia deepened, their shared confidences growing into something that felt like family. Catherine noticed the way Sophia carried herself, the hesitation in her smile, the guarded look in her eyes. And seeing so much of herself in the young woman, Catherine made it her mission to help her find a place to belong, too. One day, after a conversation at the cafe, Catherine suggested that Sophia take up a temporary position at a local bookstore. The shop was small, nestled between an antique store and a florist, but it was warm, filled with the scent of old pages and soft lighting. Catherine knew the owner, a kind man who was always in need of an extra pair of hands, and she hoped that this simple job might give Sophia a sense of purpose, a glimpse into a life she could build for herself. Sophia hesitated at first, her reluctance palpable. She had been in limbo for so long, why caught between her desire to reconnect with her father and the hurt that lingered between them. But with Catherine's encouragement, she agreed, finding herself surprisingly at ease among the shelves and the quiet company of people who only knew her as Sophia, not as Liam's daughter. As days turned to weeks, Sophia began to see small possibilities, a glimpse of a future where she could stay in Elmwood without the weight of her father's past shadowing her every step. And though the rift between them remained, there was hope now, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to reach out to Liam in small ways, each gesture building a fragile bridge between him and the rest of Elmwood. Liam's progress was slow, marked by hesitancy and small, tentative steps. At first, he would arrive at the community events only to linger near the edges, keeping himself apart as he watched from a distance. His shoulders remained tense, his gaze wary, as though expecting judgment from every passing glance. But there were others like Catherine, people who remembered him, who saw him not as an outsider, but as a man reclaiming a place that had once been his. And gradually, in the warmth of Elmwood's small gatherings, he began to feel the walls around him soften, his once guarded expression growing more open. Then came the day of the neighborhood barbecue, a small event held on a warm Saturday afternoon in the park. Catherine had made sure to invite him, sensing his reluctance, but hoping he would take the chance. And to her surprise, Liam accepted. He arrived quietly, slipping into the crowd without fanfare, his presence drawing only a few curious glances. As the day wore on, Catherine watched him from across the park, seeing how he moved carefully through the gathering, his discomfort apparent, but his resolve firm. At one point, a neighbor approached him, offering a plate of food and a friendly word. Liam hesitated, his initial instinct to withdraw, but then, slowly, he accepted, nodding his thanks with a small, tentative smile. That afternoon, something shifted in Liam. The guarded mask he wore, the one he had clung to for so long, began to crack. The weight he carried seemed to lighten, if only for a moment, as he allowed himself to experience a rare, fragile connection. And in that small act of acceptance, Catherine saw a spark of hope, a sign that perhaps his journey toward healing had begun. By the end of the day, Liam's presence felt less like a shadow and more like a piece of Elmwood's tapestry. And though the path forward remained uncertain, the people around him began to see him not as an outsider, but as one of their own. Catherine knew the road ahead would be long. Healing was not a straight path, but a journey with twists and turns, moments of doubt and steps forward. Yet with each small act of kindness, each gesture of acceptance, she was certain of one thing, that for Liam, for Sophia, and even for herself, the possibility of healing was closer than ever. In the quiet rhythm of Elmwood, friendships ran deep, often weathered by time and softened by familiarity. But Catherine's journey, her growing attachment to Liam and Sophia, had not gone unnoticed. For some, like Alice, Catherine's involvement was a cause for concern, a shift that threatened to unbalance the simplicity of their lives. Alice, the friend who had once shared every worry, every joy with Catherine, could no longer hold back her concerns. With a sigh, she turned to Catherine, her voice edged with a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "I worry about you," she admitted, a trace of sadness in her gaze. "You've been so wrapped up with them," she said, referring to Liam and Sophia. "I can't help but feel like I've lost you to this lost cause." Catherine looked at Alice, her own heart aching as she realized the toll her involvement had taken on her oldest friendship. For Catherine, helping Liam and Sophia had been a way to find meaning, to reach beyond herself, but she hadn't considered how her absence affected Alice, who had grown used to her steady presence. Seeing the hurt in Alice's eyes, Catherine felt a pang of guilt, a reminder of the sacrifices friendship often demanded. With a deep breath, Catherine reached for Alice's hand, her voice soft and full of apology. She reassured her friend that she was still there, still part of her life. But she couldn't ignore the sense of purpose she'd found, the quiet fear that without it, she might one day find herself alone. She confided this fear to Alice, her voice barely above a whisper, explaining how much her friendship meant to her, even as her heart was drawn toward helping others. Alice listened, her own frustration easing as she saw the honesty in Catherine's gaze. She gave a nod, a small gesture of understanding. And though the hurt remained, an unspoken promise passed between them, that despite the shifts and changes, their friendship would hold. For months, Catherine had been avoiding her sister's letters, each one a silent reminder of the distance, the unspoken words that lay between them. But with her newfound understanding of forgiveness, of the value of human connection, Catherine knew it was time to confront the past. Taking a steadying breath, she finally reached out to her sister, penning a letter that was equal parts apology and longing. She spoke of the years they had lost, the memories that lingered in quiet moments, the regrets she held close to her heart. When she sent the letter, she felt a weight lift, a space within her heart beginning to open. In time, a response arrived, one filled with Margaret's own confessions, her own guilt and longing. The two began a slow, careful exchange, each letter a tentative step toward reconciliation. They wrote of the past, of childhood memories and small regrets, but also of a shared hope that perhaps one day they might sit together again, not as strangers, but as sisters. Through this exchange, Catherine's internal growth became evident, her heart softening, her perspective widening. She had come to understand that forgiveness, like healing, was a journey, one that required patience, courage, and an open heart. And with each letter, she felt herself letting go of the anger she once clung to, finding a gentle strength in the possibility of reconciliation. One evening, as Catherine and Ruth sat together at the community center after an event, the light dimming around them, Ruth began to share parts of her own past. Her voice was steady, though her gaze was distant, as though she was revisiting memories from a different life. Ruth, the woman with the warm smile and steady presence, had always been something of a mystery to Catherine. But that evening, as the shadows lengthened and the air grew quiet, Ruth began to reveal the parts of herself she had kept hidden. She told Catherine of her work with troubled youth, of the lives she had touched, the hearts she had tried to heal. She spoke of the young people who had come to her, broken and lost, and of her own struggle to help them find their way. But not all of her stories had happy endings. Some of those young lives had been too fragile, too damaged to save, and those memories weighed on her like ghosts, a quiet sorrow she carried with grace. Ruth explained that her empathy for Sophia and her father came from her own regrets, her own feelings of helplessness. She had seen how pride and shame could destroy a life, how easily people could slip through the cracks, and though she had learned to make peace with the past, the experiences had shaped her, left her with an understanding that ran deep, a compassion that few could fully grasp. As Ruth spoke, Catherine felt a deep sense of connection, a kinship rooted not in shared experience but in shared understanding. Ruth's words resonated, giving Catherine a new layer of insight into her own journey, her own desire to make things right in a world filled with quiet suffering. In that moment, their friendship deepened, becoming something more than simple companionship. Catherine knew that Ruth understood the burdens she carried, the fears and hopes that had driven her to help Liam and Sophia. Together, they sat in the gathering dark, two women bound by a shared empathy, each finding strength in the other's presence. In Elmwood, the lives of Catherine, Alice, and Ruth wove together like threads in a quiet tapestry, each one a source of strength and understanding for the others. Through moments of doubt, of confrontation, of forgiveness, they had found a way forward. And though each carried her own burdens, they walked together, bound by a shared journey of compassion, resilience, and the unwavering belief that kindness could make all the difference. For a while, it seemed as though peace had finally found its way into Liam Wilder's life. He began to join the people of Elmwood to find his place among them, feeling, perhaps for the first time in years, that he could lay down the weight of his past. But peace, as Catherine knew well, was fragile, and it was a fragile peace that was soon to be tested. One chilly autumn morning, a ripple of unease spread through Elmwood. A handful of residents began whispering, faces tense, eyes shifting to Liam's house. Someone, somewhere, had stumbled upon an article from years ago, one that painted Liam in the worst possible light. It was a single article, resurrected from the depths of the internet, detailing the accusations that had nearly destroyed Liam's life. The charges had been dropped, the case dismissed, yet the words were there for all to see. a reminder of a past that many had been all too willing to believe. And now, the whispers grew louder, suspicion creeping back into Elmwood's quiet streets like a shadow. Catherine felt the weight of it, the heaviness of old judgments returning, bearing down on her heart. She watched from her window as neighbors exchanged cautious glances, as a few even crossed the street to avoid Liam's path. The careful progress he had made, the tentative steps toward acceptance, seemed to unravel before her eyes. And in her heart, Catherine knew she couldn't stand by and let him face it alone. Determined, she made her way to the community center, gathering those who had come to know her and trust her. Standing before the townspeople, she spoke with a clarity and resolve that surprised even herself, urging them to look beyond the words on a screen, to remember the man they had come to know, the man who had tried to rebuild his life in their midst. She reminded them of her own past, of the people she had cared for in her career, people whose lives had been ruined not by guilt, but by assumptions and misunderstandings. And, with quiet dignity, she asked them to offer Liam the one thing he had never received: a second chance. That evening, the residents gathered at the town hall, their faces a mix of curiosity, caution, and silent support. Liam stood at the front of the room, flanked by Catherine on one side and Sophia on the other, their quiet presence lending him strength. In the hushed room, Liam's voice, though steady, held a rawness that came from years of silence. He began to speak, his words careful and measured, each one carrying the weight of his story, his pain, and his hope for acceptance. He spoke of the accusations, of the toll it had taken on his life, of the friends and family he had lost along the way. He admitted his mistakes, his regrets, and the isolation he had chosen out of shame, out of fear that no one would ever see beyond the stain on his reputation. He explained how he had come to Elmwood not to hide, but to start anew, to find a place where he could become something more than his past. And with a tremor in his voice, he asked for their understanding, their forgiveness, their willingness to look beyond what they thought they knew. As Liam's story filled the room, Catherine glanced around, seeing the shift in expressions, the softening of eyes that had once looked at Liam with suspicion. She knew the words had reached them. Standing beside him, she felt a quiet pride, a certainty that this moment, though painful, was a step toward healing. For him, for Sophia, and perhaps even for herself. After a long silence, a murmur of support began to rise from the crowd. One by one, neighbors nodded, a few even stepping forward to shake his hand, to offer words of encouragement, small gestures of acceptance. In that moment, the walls that had kept Liam apart from Elmwood began to crumble. With time, Liam found himself embraced by the community, his presence no longer questioned, his past no longer a barrier. He began volunteering at the local shelter, helping with renovations, his quiet skills and steady hands a welcome addition to Elmwood's projects. He found a part-time job at the town library, where his gentle demeanor made him a favorite among the regulars. And most importantly, he began to rebuild his relationship with Sophia. There were days filled with awkward silences, days when old wounds surfaced, but there were also days of quiet laughter, of tentative steps toward understanding and forgiveness. For both father and daughter, it was a journey toward healing, a path lit by the small but steady light of hope. Meanwhile, Catherine watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride as she saw the difference her small acts of kindness had made. Elmwood, too, felt different. A little warmer, a little more open, a town that had found its way to compassion and acceptance in the most unexpected of ways. One evening, as the sun set over Elmwood, Catherine sat on her porch, the golden light casting long shadows across her garden. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the laughter of children playing down the street, the sound of neighbors chatting, the quiet hum of a town at peace. For Catherine, this journey had been one of self-discovery, a path that had led her not only into the lives of others, but into the depths of her own heart. She had reached out to Liam and Sophia, but in doing so, she had found herself, her purpose, her strength, and her own capacity for forgiveness. As she gazed out over Elmwood, she felt a quiet contentment, a sense that she had become a part of something bigger, something meaningful. And though life would go on with its moments of doubt, of sorrow, and of joy, she knew that she had made a difference, that in her small acts of kindness, she had helped to weave a tapestry of hope, of redemption, of belonging. One cool autumn morning, Catherine stood outside a small cafe in a neighboring town, her heart racing as she looked through the window. Seated inside was Margaret, her sister, the woman she hadn't seen in so many years, a woman with whom she shared memories both cherished and painful. Taking a deep breath, Catherine stepped inside, her footsteps slow and steady as she made her way to the table. Margaret looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise, relief, and something softer, a sisterly affection that had lain dormant, waiting for this very moment. The two sisters sat across from each other, the years of distance evident in the tentative way they spoke, as though trying to bridge a vast expanse. They began with small talk, memories of childhood seeping into the conversation, softening the edges of old wounds. Gradually, their conversation turned to the past, the misunderstandings, the pain that had driven them apart. Catherine spoke of her regrets, of the anger she had held onto, of the loss she felt at having pushed away the only family she had left. And Margaret, in turn, shared her own regrets, her own hopes that one day they could find their way back to each other. In that quiet cafe, with the autumn sun casting a warm glow over them, Catherine and Margaret chose to let go of the past, to find forgiveness in each other's company. The years of silence faded, replaced by the comfort of a shared history, a bond that, though strained, had never truly broken. In that moment, Catherine felt a weight lift from her heart, a peace she hadn't known she'd been searching for. Catherine, Liam, Sophia, and a handful of neighbors gathered on a quiet plot of land at the edge of town, their hands digging into the soil as they prepared to plant a community garden. The atmosphere was lighthearted, laughter and smiles filling the air as they worked together side by side. The garden had been Catherine's idea, a way to bring Elmwood together, to create something lasting, something beautiful that everyone could share. She watched as Liam and Sophia worked nearby, their hands dirty, their faces relaxed, the rift between them growing smaller with each passing day. She saw Ruth laughing with Alice, two friends who had come to understand and support her in ways she hadn't expected. The garden became a symbol of growth, of resilience, of the power of community. Each plant, each seed they laid into the earth held a promise that healing was possible, that no wound was too deep to mend, no past too heavy to overcome. As Catherine knelt beside Liam, planting the first flowers of the season, she felt a quiet pride, a sense of fulfillment that came not from what she had achieved alone, but from the lives she had touched, the people she had brought together. As the sun began to set, Catherine stood back, admiring the beginnings of the garden. Her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the journey that had led her here. For so long, I believed that people were just as they seemed, that their actions defined them, that their past cemented who they were. But I was wrong. Liam taught me that the heart is more complex than that compassion can heal even the deepest scars, and that judgment can be the hardest wall to tear down. I think of Sophia, her struggle to forgive, to find her own path despite the shadow of her father's past. She showed me that sometimes forgiveness is the greatest act of courage, that letting go of resentment is the first step toward freedom. And my own journey, my own heart, has softened in ways I never imagined. I learned that we are all carrying something, pain, regret, hope, and that when we reach out, when we see each other for who we truly are, we find that we are not alone. We are connected by these shared experiences, these silent battles, and it is in kindness, in compassion, that we find the strength to move forward. In the end, Catherine found that her life, once marked by solitude, had been transformed by the simple, profound act of reaching out. She had found her family, her community, and perhaps most importantly, herself. And in the gentle evening light, as the garden bloomed before her, she knew that Elmwood would continue to grow, nourished by the seeds of kindness she and her friends had sown. Thank you for being part of this journey with us, for believing in the power of compassion, forgiveness, and the beauty of second chances. If you found inspiration in Catherine's story, please like this video and share it with others who might need a reminder that no matter how deep our wounds, there is always hope for healing. Join us next time as we explore more stories of resilience,